So today we're kicking off a brand new series, a 3-week series called Filters. And if you're anything like me, when you think of the word filters, immediately my mind goes to the different types of filters that are out there. And so I just thought it would be interesting this morning to find out what you think are the top filters that come to people's minds. So we're gonna find this out by playing a little game of Family Feud, okay? I'm not gonna bring out a couple of families and have them go against each other. This is actually an audience participation game, okay? And we may or may not have surveyed 100 or so people to find out what are the top filters. We may have just made them up, probably did. But here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna find out which section of the audience knows which of the types of filters are most common in people's minds. So here's how it works. I'm going to start with this section of the crowd over here. It's okay to yell out in church. You can speak out loud in church, so don't feel uncomfortable doing that. But I would love it if somebody or a group of somebodies or a few somebodies would yell out a type of filter that comes to your mind that you think might be in the top 3 or 4, okay? Go ahead. Anybody? No, right in this section. Your turn will come, okay? Your turn will come. Just this section over here. All right, really loud, yell them out. I think I heard black and white coffee. No, these are not in the top ones. Keep going. Keep going. Instagram filter, no. Top ones. I think I heard somebody say oil up the back there. I think I heard oil. Let's see if it's up on the screen. Oil. Oil is number 2. Number 2 filter. By the way, you just won yourself an oil filter somewhere in the back there. Congratulations. Give them a big round of applause. Here's what you do. Take the oil filter to your mechanic next time you get the oil changed and save you a few bucks, okay? All right, the middle section, you guys ready? Top filters that come to mind. Go ahead. Okay, furnace. Air. Somebody said air down the front row. Let's see. Air filter. Number 3, congratulations. You just won yourself an air filter. And that looks like it's for like the size of an RV or something. So probably useless in your home, but that's fine. All right, over here, this section, go ahead, yell them out nice and loud. Water filter, this guy right down the front, let's see. Water filter, correct, number 1 answer. And water filters are ridiculously expensive. So we got you a straw instead that has a filter in it, and it's only useful for you. Nobody else can benefit from the water that's filtered through that. But when we're talking about filters in this series, I don't want us to think of those top 3 things. In fact, the type of filter I want you to kind of think through the lens of is photography filters, okay? So photography filters number 4 is the one that I want you to think about as it relates to this 3-part series. Now, photography filters, I think, are probably used more today than in any other time in history. In fact, some of the finest photographers on the planet are using filters every single day, as evidenced by what you see online. These filters right here by these fine photographers. And then this next one, oh, look at the cute Kim Kardashian. That was like 38 minutes ago that Kim took that picture, I guess. Probably a lot longer ago than that. But when it comes to filters, I actually, as I look online, as I look along social media and so on, some of my favorite images that I see actually come with this hashtag right here, hashtag no filter. I don't know if you've looked online and seen a bunch of images that have this hashtag, but essentially what they're saying is you're looking at it exactly the way that I took the photograph. My wife, Kristen, and I, we last month were up in the mountains, and we stumbled into this gallery in this little town that we were in, and we spent 20 or 30 minutes looking at photographs in this gallery before we had even realized how much time had passed because of how spectacular the images were. Tony Newland is the name of the photographer, and you can see some of the images that were in the gallery there. Just absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous images. One of the things I remember from our time in the gallery was the curator talking over and over again. I don't know how many times she said this, but she said, these images, all the images you're looking at, have absolutely no filter. They were taken with no filter. In fact, there was no Photoshop editing done on any of these images. These images are exactly the same as the scene and the moment in which they were captured. Absolutely spectacular. This one of the buffalo, I couldn't believe it. It's like, imagine being out there and capturing that image in that moment. And what came to my mind as we were in the gallery was this idea that all of the images I was looking at, all the images Kristen and I were looking at, They were exactly the way that God had designed them to be seen. There was no filter, there was no editing. These moments, these scenes were exactly the same as the way that God had designed us to view them. It was spectacular, just amazing to me, the images that we got to see. At this time of year, every year as we go into the holiday season, I'm always reminded of the incredible gifts that God has given to us. It's a time of year where I'm reminded of the fact that there are so many things in my life that are provided to me, so many gifts and blessings that I did not give to myself. That's why when I think about God's gifts to us, whether you believe in God or whether you're a Bible person or a church person or a Jesus follower or not, I think all of us have to agree. There are certain blessings, certain gifts, certain things that we have that are a part of our lives that we know we didn't give ourselves. They had to have come from somewhere. And so as I think about these gifts at this time of year that we're given, and as I think about this idea of seeing things exactly the way that God created them to be seen, this question has come to my mind. What if we viewed the gifts our Heavenly Father has given us with no filter? What if we were able to see them, or what if we viewed them the way He views them? What if we looked at these gifts and we viewed them exactly the same way that He views them? I think the challenge that our Heavenly Father has for us to see these gifts the way that He sees them is a similar challenge that all of us as parents in the room, if you're a parent, it's a similar challenge that we have with our children. See, we wish that our children could see things the way that we see things. Or maybe if you're not a parent, but you're a little bit older, you wish that your loved ones could see things the way that you see things. Parents, think about it this way with your children. You wish that they could see time the way that you see time. You wish that they could see friendships and relationships the way that you see friendships and relationships. Maybe especially the mums in the room, or the moms, however you want to say that. Maybe you wish your children would see sugar the way you see sugar. I think the challenge is similar too with spouses. We wish that our spouse could see things the way that we see things. Maybe you wish that your spouse could see money the way you see money. Or we wish that our spouse could see sex the way you see sex. Or you wish that your spouse could see money the way that you see money. It's really just two categories, so let's go back to parenting. Ultimately, as parents, we wish that our kids could see things the way that we see things. And in those moments, there's something that comes to our mind, and it may even slip out of our mouths. We might even actually say these words, "Someday you'll understand." Someday, if you could see things the way I see things, someday you'll actually understand. Because our hope is that if our kids could see what we see, that they would do what we say. That's our hope. If you could see, my child, if you could see as I see, you would do what I say. So this series, Filters, I want to give you kind of the premise or the summary statement of what we're talking about for the next few weeks. And I understand, as soon as I put this up on the screen, for some of you in the room, there's going to be some pushback to what you read. But here's what I believe as it relates to filters. When we see as God sees, we tend to do what He says. When we see as God sees, we tend to do what He says. And I know for some of you in the room, that's your whole reason for not being a part of church. Maybe that's your whole reason for giving God the stiff arm. Maybe that's your whole reason for no longer following Jesus, or deciding at some time in your life to never follow Jesus, because you were convinced that God just wants me to do what He says. He just wants me to obey blindly and just do whatever it is that He says. Let me give you an analogy of what God really wants. Right now, in rooms all across our church, there are middle schoolers that are sitting with elementary or preschool age kids in circles, hoping that those kids might see what they see. There are high schoolers this morning, while we've been here, who are sitting with sixth grade girls, hoping that they might see middle school the way they now see middle school. There are college-age students, young adults, older adults who are with all of those different age groups, hoping as they sit in circles that they might see as they now see. Not because they want them to do what they say, not because they want in some way to lord it over them. And if you would see what I see, you would then do what I say. No, it's way better than that. It's way better than that. When a high school girl sits down with sixth grade girls in a small group, in a circle, her hope is that they might have a better middle school experience than what they had. They might see what they see now so that their life might be better than theirs was. That's their hope. That's their goal. As parents, we don't want children just to see what we see so that they would do what we say. Our hope is that they would have a better life. In fact, we hope they would have the best life possible. That's our desire. And that's the same desire as our Heavenly Father. He doesn't want you just to see what He sees so that you'll do what He says. It's way better than that. He wants you to see what He sees so that you can live the best possible life He has for you. That's His heart's desire. And so over the next few weeks, we're going to take a look at these gifts over here that I think are common to every single person in the room. Whether you follow Jesus, whether you're a church person or not, really makes no difference. These are common to all of us. And my hope is that as we see as He sees, we might begin to live the best life possible that He wants for us. So the first gift that we're going to look at today is this one in box number 1. This is a gift that every single one of us in the room have been given. It's the gift of time. It's the gift of time, and really, time is way bigger than just the gift of time. When you think about time, time is made up of seconds and minutes, and you think about time in your life, really time makes up the entirety of your life. So God hasn't just given us the gift of time, He's given us the gift of life, because seconds turn into minutes, and minutes turn into hours, and hours turn into days and weeks and months and years, and they make up the totality of our lives. So God has really given us not just the gift of time, He's given us the gift of life. But here's what happens. We tend to think in terms of time, we tend to think very similar as it relates to time as we think to how it relates to money. We say things like this: how am I spending my time? Or we say things like, am I wasting time? Or how am I investing time? See, time is such a valuable commodity for us because it is the sum of our lives. Our time is our lives. And so when you think about time, it really is probably one of our most valuable assets that we have. Think about this for a moment. At the end of your life, and maybe you've experienced this with a loved one, but at the end of your life, you will probably spend an unbelievable amount of money just to extend your time a little bit. Or think of it this way: how valuable is your time? If there was some sort of new technology available today that allowed me to come up to you and say, hey, I'd like to buy the last 6 months of your time and add that onto my time, how much would that be worth to you? What value would you put on that amount of time? Time is so incredibly valuable to us, but I don't want us just to see it the way that we see it. I think it's so important for us to answer this question: how does God see our time? How does God see our time? And so over the next few minutes, I want to introduce you to, or reintroduce you, or remind you of a famous guy in the Bible who I think gives us great insight into how God views our time. His name is Moses. And Christians, for those of you that aren't Christians or church is not your deal, you need to understand, and this is really important, Christians don't take Moses seriously just because he was a figure in our favorite childhood movie, The Prince of Egypt. No, that's not the reason why. It's not even that we take him seriously just because he was in the Bible. The reason we take Moses so seriously is because Jesus took him seriously. In fact, Jesus quoted Moses in his teachings. He talked about Moses when he was teaching. That's how serious Jesus took Moses, and that's why we give so much credibility to the story of Moses. It is one of my favorite childhood movies, and it is one of my favorite childhood stories as well. One of my favorite stories of the Bible is the story of Moses. Moses, as you may remember, taken from his own family, and he was put into the family of Pharaoh. In fact, he grew up in the palace in Egypt with Pharaoh and his family. So he grew up with an incredible life of luxury. He had all of the comforts in the world, an incredible life of comfort. And yet, as he got older, Moses' story goes on to tell us he began to look out as a young adult, as a young man. He began to look around Egypt, and he saw the suffering of his people, the people that his family came from. They were enslaved in Egypt, and he began to see this suffering, and he really got a fatal case of purpose. As he looked at the suffering that was going on, he began to ask the question, what could be done about this? Or even more important, what could I do about this suffering? And Moses, he didn't know what his story would end up like. We know the end of his story now, but Moses in those moments, he didn't know what his story would end up like. He didn't know what would happen if he stepped out of the palace and tried to engage the situation of his people. He had no clue what the future would hold. But ultimately, Moses made a decision. Moses made a choice, and the choice was this. He chose purpose over pleasure. Instead of taking just the comforts of the palace and the life that he had been given, living with Pharaoh in Egypt, he chose purpose over pleasure. Before we dive into this lesson we're going to learn from Moses, I just want to kind of a side note, a little bit of a free lesson. Anytime you run across someone, anytime you discover someone, anytime you read about somebody who has made this decision, has made this choice of purpose over pleasure, take notice. They are onto something. They have discovered something incredibly important. And that's what Moses had discovered. Moses, in a psalm, he writes for us about how God sees time. Now, the way that Moses writes, the way that he described it is very poetic, and quite frankly, it's not written like we would write today, and he doesn't speak in the similar language that we would speak in today. And so I just want to give you, before we dive into the psalm, kind of the summary statement of what Moses is saying in this psalm. Here's the summary of what he's saying. There is no purpose apart from context. Throughout the psalm, he's got some incredible language. It's very poetic, but ultimately what Moses is trying to communicate is that there is no purpose apart from context. Let me illustrate what I mean for you. I have this crate that sits in my garage, and every so often we'll be in the garage and one of my kids will get into this crate. You might have a crate similar in your garage, or maybe it's a drawer in your house somewhere, but it looks a little bit like this. Maybe you've got one of these as well. I'm a technology junkie, so there's stuff in here that I'm not even sure when it was invented, but my kids will get into this every now and again, and they'll pull something out, a cable or an adapter like this, and they'll begin asking questions. It's like a history lesson in our house. I begin giving them the history that, yes, when I was a child in the 70s, we did have electricity. I know it's hard to believe, but we did have electricity. And in the 90s, computers were around. I know it's hard to believe. You think they just showed up on the scene, but they've been around for a while. And as we pull out these different cables, oftentimes they'll begin asking me questions. They'll say, Dad, hey, what does this go to? What does this adapter go to? Or what is this for? Ultimately, they'll ask me the question, Dad, what does this connect to? And what they don't realize in that moment when they're asking that question is they're really asking a purpose question. See, they're asking this question about what this thing goes to or what it connects to because they want to understand what is the purpose for this cable. And what Moses is about to tell us is that when it comes to purpose, there is no purpose apart from context. When my kids discover, or when we discover what they connect to, we discover what they are here for. When my kids discover it, when we discover it, when it comes to our lives, when we discover what we connect to, we understand and we begin to discover what we are here for. Moses, he starts out the psalm in this way. He says it this way: Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Moses understands the generations that came before him. He was well aware the Jewish people understood all of their forefathers and all the generations before them. And he's saying, with all of the generations, including mine and all the generations to come, God, you have been our dwelling place. You have been the place. You have been the thing that we're constantly connected to. You are, God, you are our context. That's what Moses is saying. And then he goes on and he says something that's absolutely brilliant. When you think about when Moses is writing this, 1,300 years before Jesus even shows up on the scene, what he's about to say to us is absolutely brilliant. Listen to what he says. Before the mountains were born, you brought forth the whole world from everlasting to everlasting. You are God. You have to understand, Moses was raised in Egypt, where the people in that culture and in that time, they believed in many, many gods. He probably was raised worshiping or taught to worship the sun god, Ra. And so for Moses to have this understanding in this time and in this place is absolutely groundbreaking. That he would understand not only that God has been from everlasting to everlasting, but that you are not a God, but you are God, singular. Moses has this incredible insight. And ultimately what Moses has discovered and what he's teaching us is this, is that God's eternal existence is the context for our lives. That's what we connect to. That's what we find our context in. God's eternal existence, his everlasting to everlasting, is the context for our lives. Remember, there is no purpose without context. Then Moses goes on to talk about the brevity of life, and he begins to unpack for us exactly how God sees time. He says, you turn people back to dust, saying, return to dust, you mere mortals. The most Gandalf-like saying in all of the Bible, I think. Return to dust, you mortals. And then he goes on and he begins to explain exactly how God views time. 1,000 years, God, in your sight, are like a day that has just gone by, or even smaller than that, or like a watch in the night. A watch in the night in those days was a 3-hour period of time when somebody would be on a shift to watch out for the enemy. Moses is saying 1,000 human years is like 3 hours in God time. We think about dog years. I have a dog, 8 years old. 8 years old really is 56 years old in dog years. Think about it in God time. If we're to live for, say, 70 or maybe 80 years, the average life, that's like 10 to 15 minutes in God time. How short and how fast our lives go by. 70 or 80 years in human time, like 10 to 15 minutes in God time. It's like listening to 2 or 3 songs on the radio. Steve Jobs put 1,000 songs on a device we could put in our pocket. Hundreds of people's lives in our pocket. That's how fast it goes by in God's time. 1,000 years, like a watch in the night. He goes on to explain the brevity of life. He says, yet you sweep people away in the sleep of death. They are like the new grass of the morning. New grass of the morning? Moses, what are you talking about? So glad you asked. I'll go on to explain, Moses says. In the morning, it springs up new, but by evening, it is dry and withered. In other words, Moses is saying, here today, gone tomorrow. That's what our lives are like. Like 10 to 15 minutes, like 2 or 3 songs on the radio, and our lives are done. I don't know about you, but at this point in the psalm, I'm thinking, whew, Thanks for the pep talk, Moses. Got anything positive to say? Got anything that might help us with time? That might help us to see some purpose in our lives? If they're so short, if they're here today, gone tomorrow, I think Moses is kind of luring us in. He's almost begging us to ask the obvious question in the room. If they're so short, then what's the point? Then what's the point? If our lives are here and then they're gone tomorrow, they're 10 to 15 minutes in God time, then what's the point? Remember that there is no purpose apart from context. There is no purpose apart from context. In a sense, we're asking the question like my children ask, then what is this short life? What is this short life? Or maybe a better question, if we're here today and gone tomorrow, what is this short life for? Or maybe, what am I here for? What am I here for if I'm here today and gone tomorrow? If the life is so short, then what am I here for? What we're going to discover, and what we discover from this crate when my kids ask me, what's this short life for? Or what am I here for? We understand that purpose requires a connection. Purpose requires a connection. When you understand what it's connected to, you understand the purpose for it. But until you understand that, Moses goes on to describe in the next few verses, they're so morbid, I didn't even want to read them out loud, but he summarizes a life that has never discovered its connection and has never discovered its purpose. Here's what he says in verse 10. Our days may come to 70 years or 80 if our strength endures, yet the best of them are but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass and we fly away. Moses is saying the person that never discovers their connection, never discovers their purpose, their life is going to be described as starting one thing, then moving to another thing, trying to find purpose, trying to find meaning, and they go from one thing to the next, and ultimately their time goes by and they fly away without any meaning and without any purpose. So Moses, help us out a little bit. Give us some encouragement, or give us, what do we do now that we understand how God sees time? What do we do with that? Moses goes on, if only we knew. If only we knew. If only we knew what? Are you saying nobody knows? Is there someone that knows? If only we knew. What is it that we need to know? And he says, if only we knew. The power of your anger, your wrath, is as great as the fear that is your due. Well, that solves it. It's like my new life verse. That explains everything. I'm going to put it up on my fridge and be reminded if only we knew the power of your anger and the wrath that is so great and the fear that is your due. What do you mean by that? I thought we were talking about time, Moses. What does that have to do with time? Let me kind of put it for you in kind of Perko Australian English. Let me explain to you what I think he's saying. If we could see God as he is, we would give him the respect that he is due. If we could see the grandness of God, his power, his greatness, his anger, even his wrath, if we could just see how grand and how great he is, we would give him the respect that he is due. But here's the problem. We all have this problem. In fact, Moses had this problem. He couldn't see God's glory. He couldn't see his grandness. In fact, he turned his back when he went by him. And Moses still came back to the people, and his face was like a light bulb. That's how grand God is. In fact, that's why I give any person in the room permission. If somebody says to you, God appeared to me, you can say, there's no way, because your face would be melted off your skull if God had appeared to you. It's impossible. Because we all have this problem. Here's the problem we have. We have a filtered view of God's glory, so we lack the desire to be in his story. That's why we don't plug into the context of the everlasting to everlasting, because we have a filtered view of the grandness of him and what he's doing in this world. If we could see If we could see God as he really is, then we would give him the respect he is due. Not only that, we would discover that God has created us on purpose for his purpose. We discover that the everlasting to everlasting and the story that he is writing is so grand that all we'd want to do is just say, how can I be a part of that story? It's so glorious. I want to be a part of that story. Moses summarizes everything he's talking about, and he gives us a prayer, a lesson that we can learn. He says it this way: teach us to number our days then, God. Or another way to say this: God, would you help us to understand that our days are numbered? That our 10 to 15 minutes will go by so fast. Would you help us to understand that? Why? So that we may gain a heart of wisdom. You know what wisdom is? Wisdom is the ability to see something from its broadest perspective, from its grandest view. God, would you teach us to number our days so that in so doing we could see the grandness of what you are doing throughout the continuum of time, from everlasting to everlasting. God, teach us to number our days so we can gain this heart of wisdom. When you begin to do that, you'll no longer ask this question: what am I here for? See, when you ask the question, as we all have and we tend to do quite a bit, what am I here for? Why am I here? What am I here for? Here's how Moses summarizes somebody that just answers the question, what am I here for? Your days may come to 70 or 80 years if your strength endures, yet the best of them will be trouble and sorrow, for they will quickly pass and you will fly away. If you just answer the question, what am I here for? That will be the summary of your life. The better and the bigger and the grander question is this: who am I here for? Moses discovered, I'm here for the everlasting to everlasting. That's who I'm here for. Not what am I here for, but who am I here for? The best way I can explain this to you is through a simple illustration of something that I learned way back when I first got out of university. I was a phys ed teacher for just a few years, and one of the things that we would do on a rainy day, especially if we couldn't go outside, or let's be honest, if we hadn't really planned our lesson very well, one of the things we would do is we'd play a little game of tug of war. It's a simple game. It's super easy to set up. You just divide the classroom into two teams, and then you find a rope. And sometimes we'd find a piece of cloth. Sometimes it was just some kid's dirty sock or T-shirt that was left and lost and found, or whatever it was. You'd line them up on each end of the rope, draw a line, and then you would tie this object, sock, T-shirt, whatever it was, you would tie it to the rope. And as I think about this, I think of this rope as the everlasting to everlasting. Can't see the end of it. And this rag, the moment that it is connected to the everlasting to everlasting, it immediately gains purpose. On its own, it's just a rag. It's just a dirty sock. It's just a T-shirt that was in Lost and Found. But the moment that you connect it to the everlasting to everlasting, it finds its purpose. It finds its meaning. This is why I'm so grateful that hundreds, even 1,000 or more years ago, there was a guy named Paul who had an encounter with Jesus. And he understood that although his time was like 10 to 15 minutes in God time, when he connected it to the everlasting to everlasting, he found his purpose, he found his context. And because he did, we are all sitting here today. It's why I'm so grateful. As I look out into the audience, I see people with green T-shirts on that say Wombaland. They wouldn't wear them unless they were given them and asked to wear them on a Sunday. Let's be honest. You know what they've discovered? They've discovered that by investing in a preschooler, by investing their time in a student, by investing their time in a smelly middle schooler, by investing their time in an elementary age kid, by investing their time serving in the community, by investing their time by helping out the homeless, by connecting their time, their 10 to 15 minutes of time in God's eye, to the everlasting to everlasting, it gives them purpose. It gives them meaning. It's why years from now, you and I will all be long gone. And if God allows the time to keep going, others will come along and they will connect to the everlasting to everlasting. And in that moment, although their lives are so short, just 10 to 15 minutes in God's time, the moment they connect to the continuum of the everlasting to the everlasting, that is the moment that they find their purpose. Say, Jason, man, I understand it, but it's so hard. Every day I wake up, eternity, the everlasting to everlasting is not hitting me in the face. In fact, quite the opposite. I get in my car, I go to work, I go to school, and the temporal, the thing for now, the here and now is the thing that hits me in my face. How should we be constantly reminded of the everlasting to everlasting? I go back to the beginning of the psalm. Moses, he began, before the mountains were formed. You realize the privilege we have living in the city we live in? Every day we wake up and the everlasting to everlasting is a reminder through the mountains to us every single day. Before that peak was even formed, he was there. Before it ever goes away, or when it goes away, he will still be there. So here's what I'd like you to do. Today, you're going to walk out in just a moment. And when you see that mountain, I'd like you to be reminded of this truth. Even if you don't follow Jesus, even if you're not a church person, even if you're not sure if God exists, when you see that mountain, here's the thought that I want you to have. I was created on purpose for God's purpose. In fact, I'd like us to say it out loud. I think it's so important. So on the count of 3, would you do me a favor and just say it out loud? 1, 2, 3. I was created on purpose for God's purpose. That was pretty decent. I think we can do better. You guys ready? I was created on purpose for God's purpose. Would you do me a favor? When you walk out the doors today and you see that mountain, maybe say it out loud, maybe say it to yourself. If it's kind of weird to say it out loud, that's fine. Look at the mountain. Say, God, I was created on purpose. I want to connect to the everlasting to everlasting so I can find my purpose because I was created on purpose for God's purpose. Let me pray for you. God, thank you for the constant reminder that we have in this place that we live in of the fact that you are everlasting to everlasting. And although you view our time going so quickly, God, I thank you for the fact that we can connect to you and find our purpose in the everlasting to everlasting. God, would you help us to do that? God, would you give us the understanding of what we need to do and then the courage to do it? We pray in Jesus' name.